The obsidian walls of the High Synod of Xalanthia did not reflect the light of the twin suns. Rather, they seemed to swallow it, drinking in the luminosity of the galaxy only to breathe back a suffocating, heavy shadow that lay across the shoulders of every delegate present. The air was thick with the scent of ozone and the pheromones of high anxiety, a chemical cocktail of fear that transcended species barriers. In the center of the vast, circular amphitheater, a holographic projection shimmered, not with the usual calm blue of strategic dominance, but with a jagged, angry crimson that pulsed in rhythm with the silent panic seizing the hearts of the galaxy's oldest empire. High Exarch Valen, his chitinous armor polished to a mirror sheen that belied the turmoil beneath his carapace, gripped the edges of his podium until the stone groaned under the pressure. He looked out over the assembly, representatives from 1,000 subjugated systems, diplomats of the hegemony, and the warlords who had enforced the Pax Xalanthia for 10,000 cycles, and he saw the one thing he had never witnessed in his 3 centuries of life: hesitation. The silence in the chamber was not the silence of peace. It was the silence of a held breath before the plunge, the terrifying quiet of a predator realizing it has unknowingly stalked something far larger, far darker, and infinitely more dangerous than itself. They were discussing the Sol Isolation Zone, a region of space that had been scrubbed from public star charts 500 cycles ago, a quarantine sector designated with the highest level of existential threat markers. The strategy had been simple, cruel, and logically sound, or so the High Council had believed at the time. The humans, a fledgling species with a worrying propensity for rapid technological adaptation and a chaotic, indomitable will, had been deemed a destabilizing variable in the precise equation of the hegemony's control. Instead of a costly war of extermination which might have galvanized them or scattered their survivors to the winds to fester like a virus, the hegemony had chosen suffocation. They had erected the Great Damping Field, a masterpiece of gravimetric engineering that encapsulated the entire Sol system. It was designed to stifle hyperdimensional travel, dampen high-energy physics, and effectively cut Earth off from the universe's resources. The logic was cold. Deprived of the ability to expand, forced to cannibalize their own system for survival, humanity would turn inward. They would fight over scraps, descend into barbarism, and eventually wither away, becoming nothing more than a cautionary footnote in the hegemony's archives. For 5 centuries, the field had held. For 5 centuries, the sensors had reported a gradual cessation of high-energy signatures. The hegemony had stopped watching, satisfied that the Terran problem had solved itself through the induced entropy of isolation. But the sensors were wrong. Strategos Calith, a reptilian commander whose scars told the history of a dozen border wars, stepped into the light of the projection, his heavy tail sweeping across the floor with a sound like dry leaves. He did not look at Valen. He looked at the red, pulsing light of the hologram. He spoke, his voice a gravelly rumble that vibrated in the chests of the listeners, detailing the anomaly that had shattered their complacency. The damping field had not failed due to external sabotage or mechanical decay. It had been dismantled, and it had been dismantled from the inside. The readings were nonsensical, defying the known laws of physics that the hegemony held as sacred scripture. The energy output required to shatter the gravimetric barriers was equivalent to the simultaneous detonation of a star cluster, yet there had been no explosion, no shockwave, no chaotic release of radiation. There had simply been a moment of absolute stillness, a sudden negation of the barrier, as if a giant hand had reached out and quietly erased the walls of a prison. Calith's report was clinically detached, but his pheromones betrayed a terror that was spreading through the chamber like a contagion. The Sol system was no longer dark. It was blazing with a signature that the sensors could not classify, a cold, coherent luminosity that felt less like technology and more like a fundamental rewrite of reality. The debate that erupted was chaotic, a cacophony of clicking mandibles, synthesized voices, and guttural roars. Some called for an immediate preemptive strike, the mobilization of the Grand Armada to glass the system before whatever monstrosity had been bred in the dark could escape. Others, the more scientifically inclined, argued that any species capable of silently dismantling a damping field was already beyond the reach of conventional weapons. Valen tried to restore order, slamming his staff against the dais, but the fear was too deep. They had tried to weaken the humans, to starve them of the G. Alaxi's light, and in doing so they had created a crucible. The realization was dawning on them, horrific and undeniable. By sealing the humans in a box with limited resources and existential pressure, they had not broken them. They had forced them to evolve. They had removed the crutch of easy expansion and replaced it with the necessity of absolute efficiency. The humans had not fought over scraps. They had learned to eat the dark. The noise in the chamber reached a fever pitch, only to be cut off instantly, severed as cleanly as a wire. The lights in the High Synod died. Not a flicker, not a dimming, but an instant total plunge into absolute blackness. The air recycling system ceased their hum. The gravitational stabilizers disengaged, leaving the delegates floating in the sudden, nauseating weightlessness of the void. Panic flared, but before it could turn to a stampede, a new light appeared. It did not come from the projectors. It came from everywhere and nowhere, a soft, white luminescence that seemed to originate from the air itself, permeating the chamber without casting a shadow. A sound began to build, a low, resonant thrum that was felt in the bone marrow rather than heard by the ears. It was the sound of immense power under perfect control. Then the walls of the obsidian chamber, walls that had stood for 10,000 years, simply became transparent. They did not retract. They phased out of visual existence, revealing the cold vacuum of space outside the station. And there, filling the void, blocking out the stars, was the answer to their 5 centuries of silence. It was not a fleet in the way the hegemony understood fleets. There were no thrusters burning with chemical fire, no jagged hulls of durasteel bristling with kinetic cannons. These were monoliths of geometry, vast shapes of matte white and absolute black that hung in the void like silent gods. They were enormous, their scale-defying perspective, dwarfing the hegemony's orbital defense platforms like mountains dwarfing anthills. They did not drift, they occupied space with a terrifying solidity. Between these leviathans flowed rivers of coherent light, connecting them in a lattice of energy that pulsed with a heartbeat rhythm. There were no seams, no rivets, no weapons ports. They looked less like ships and more like mathematical axioms given physical form. The sheer mass of them should have torn the station apart with tidal forces, yet the station remained perfectly still, cradled in a gravitational null zone that the visitors had projected with casual ease. The humans had arrived. They had not come with fire and fury. They had arrived with the terrifying calmness of a species that had long ago transcended the need for bluster. A voice filled the chamber, originating from the omnipresent light. It was not synthesized. It was human. It was calm, melodious, and carried a weight of sorrow and wisdom that silenced the soul. It spoke in High Zalanthian, the dialect of the court, but with a precision and elegance that shamed the native speakers. The voice introduced itself as Prime Architect Valerius. He did not offer threats. He did not demand surrender. He simply asked for audience. The psychological impact of this politeness was more devastating than a bombardment. If they had come screaming for revenge, the hegemony would have understood. Rage is a known quantity. But this serene, godlike patience implied a level of superiority that made the concept of war seem quaint, like children wrestling in the mud. Valen, floating in the center of the chamber, found his voice. He demanded to know their intent, his tone shaking with a bravado he did not feel. Valerius responded by reshaping the projection in the room. The view of the fleet shifted, zooming in on the hull of the lead vessel, a sphere of perfect alabaster the size of a small moon. The hull was not solid matter as the aliens knew it. The view magnified, going deeper, past the molecular level, revealing that the ship was constructed of stabilized neutronium and folded spacetime, materials that the hegemony theorized were impossible to manipulate. Valerius explained, his voice echoing with the gravity of history. He told them of the years under the damping field. He described the first century of despair, the resource wars, the near collapse of the biosphere. He spoke of the moment humanity realized that the galaxy had abandoned them to die. And then he spoke of the turning. Forced to survive in a closed system, humanity had to solve the problem of entropy. They could not waste a single joule of energy. They could not discard a single atom of matter. They had to achieve perfect efficiency. The blockade intended to starve them had instead forced them to master the fundamental fabric of reality. Because they could not travel outward, they traveled inward, cracking the codes of quantum mechanics, biological immortality, and matter-energy conversion. They had turned the H not into a tomb, but into a garden of eternal recycling, and then, having mastered their own cradle, they turned their eyes to the cage. They studied the damping field not as a wall, but as a tutor. They learned how it worked, how it manipulated gravity, and they improved upon it. They built a fleet not to conquer territory, for they could create matter from energy and needed nothing the hegemony possessed, but to break the silence. Valerius paused, and the silence stretched, heavy with the realization of the hegemony's failure. They had tried to create a corpse. They had instead forged a god. Strategos Calith, his pragmatic mind racing, asked the question that hung in the air. If you have no need of our resources and you have transcended our weapons, why are you here? Is it retribution? Do you seek to punish the jailers? The question was a gamble, an admission of guilt that could have signed their death warrants. The human fleet shifted slightly, the lattice of light intensifying. Valerius's laughter was soft, devoid of malice, a sound like distant thunder. He explained that revenge was an inefficient expenditure of energy, a primitive drive belonging to a version of humanity that had died in the isolation. They were not here to destroy the hegemony. They were here because the damping field, in its crude blocking of subspace frequencies, had blinded the rest of the galaxy to what was listening in the dark. This was the reveal that shifted the axis of the world. The humans had not just been surviving, they had been listening. With their sensors tuned to the absolute limit of sensitivity to find energy sources within their prison, they had heard the echoes coming from beyond the galactic rim. The hegemony, fat and complacent in its dominance, distracted by petty politics and internal suppression, had been deaf to the signal. The humans played it now for the Council. It was a sound that clawed at the mind, a dissonant, wet-tearing noise that induced immediate nausea in every biological entity in the room. It was the sound of a great devourer, a cosmic locust swarm that operated on a biological and dimensional level, consuming not just matter, but the physical laws that bound the universe together. It was coming. It had been coming for thousands of years, drawn to the high-energy emissions of the hegemony's careless expansion. Valerius explained that the strongest fleet in the universe was not built to fight the hegemony. It was built to fight for them. The humans had realized centuries ago that when the barrier fell, they would emerge into a galaxy that was sleepwalking into its own extinction. They had spent the last 200 years of their isolation weaponizing their own survival engines. Their ships were designed to withstand the breakdown of physics, to fight in conditions where logic failed. They had turned themselves into the immune system of the galaxy. The irony washed over the Council like a cold wave. The hegemony had tried to weaken humanity to protect their own power, and in doing so, they had inadvertently created the only shield capable of saving them from total annihilation. The monsters they had feared were actually the guardians they didn't deserve. The atmosphere in the Synod changed from terror to a profound, humbling shame. The humans offered an alliance. It was not a request for permission. It was a statement of fact. The human fleet would deploy to the galactic rim to intercept the entity they called the Hollow. They offered the hegemony a choice: continue their petty squabbles and die in the darkness, or integrate their technology with human logical structures and assist in the logistics of survival. The humans needed the hegemony's biomass and raw materials, not to consume, but to build the barricades. They needed the billions of lives in the hegemony not as slaves, but as partners in a war for existence. The climax of the encounter came not with a battle, but with a gesture. Valerius lowered the privacy shielding of his own vessel. For the first time, the aliens saw the humans. They were not the ragged, desperate scavengers the propaganda had painted. They were radiant. Cybernetically integrated, genetically perfected, their bodies glowing with the same internal energy that powered their ships. They stood on the bridge of their star sphere, looking down at the Synod with expressions of profound pity and determination. Valen looked into the eyes of the human commander and saw no hatred, only the weary, steely resolve of a parent watching a child playing with fire. The human spoke one last time before the transmission cut to tactical data streams. "You tried to bury us in the dark," Valerius said, his voice echoing across the fleets and the council chamber, resonating in the very hull of the station. "You did not know that we are the seeds that only grow in the night. Now stand with us or step aside. The storm is here and we are the only shelter." As the holographic in T, our face dissolved into a tactical map of the galactic rim, showing the encroaching darkness of the Hollow and the brilliant, star-like formation of the human fleet moving to intercept it. The silence in the High Synod was broken not by argument, but by the frantic, unified movement of 1,000 species realizing that their worldview had been shattered. The hegemony was dead, dissolved in an instant of revelation. In its place, something new began to form, forged in the wake of the human wake. The fleets of the aliens, once symbols of oppression, turned their prows to follow the white spheres of the Terrans. They were clumsy, archaic, and weak compared to the Golden Armada leading the charge, but they followed. They followed because the humans had proven the ultimate truth of the universe. That which tries to destroy you if it fails only serves to sharpen your blade. The humans had been the anvil and the hegemony the hammer, and now the sword was drawn, ready to face the endless night.